You noticed it first in the silence. That strange, uncomfortable silence that follows you into rooms now. The one that used to be filled with noise, with laughter, with people who thought they knew exactly who you were. They don't ask it out loud. Not yet. But you can see it in the way their eyes linger a second too long. In the way their smile arrives just a little late. In the way their questions circle around the real question, the one they are all too afraid to say directly. What happened to you? Not what happened to you. Like they care. What happened to you like they need an explanation for something they cannot explain. Because the version of you they buried, the broken one, the exposed one, the one who failed in front of everyone, that version is gone. And they do not know where it went. And it is creeping them out. Because people can handle your pain. Pain is familiar. Pain makes sense to them. What they cannot handle is your peace. Your peace after everything. Your silence that no longer begs for their approval. Your eyes that no longer search the room for permission to exist. They watched you fall. They were there. Some of them helped push. Some of them just watched, arms crossed, waiting for the story to end, the way these stories always end, with you smaller, with you quieter, with you gone. But you did not disappear. You went somewhere they could not follow, somewhere with no cameras, no audience, no applause, a place with no name, just work and silence and the sound of your own breathing in rooms nobody else walked into. And that is the part they cannot forgive. Not the fall, the return. Let's talk about the wound. Because before we talk about who you have become, we have to be honest about who you were when it happened. You remember the exact moment, don't you? The moment it all came apart. Maybe it was public. Maybe everyone saw it happen in real time. Comments stacking up like nails in a coffin. They were building for you while you were still breathing. Maybe it was private. A quiet unraveling. Nobody clapped for, nobody posted about, just you, alone. Watching everything you built collapse in a silence so loud it felt like screaming. Either way, it stripped you. It took the mask. It took the performance. It took the version of you that smiled for people who never truly saw you, that shrank yourself so others could feel comfortable, that apologized for taking up space in a life that was always yours to take up. And when it was gone, when the applause stopped, and the messages stopped, and the people who called themselves your people stopped answering, you were left with something you had been avoiding your entire life. Yourself. Just you. No filter. No audience. No explanation that would satisfy anyone, because the truth is never satisfying to people who only wanted the highlight reel. You sat with that. Some nights you did not sleep. Some mornings you did not want to get up, because getting up meant facing a world that had already decided who you were before you even opened your eyes. You carried shame that was not entirely yours to carry. You carried judgment from people who never once offered to carry anything with you. And somewhere in that darkness, somewhere between the version of you that used to perform for approval and the version of you that had nothing left to perform, something happened. It was not dramatic. Nobody was watching, so there was no reason for it to be dramatic. It was quiet. It was almost invisible. It was the moment you stopped asking why this happened to me and started asking what this is going to make of me. That is the turn. That is the exact second the story stopped being about your fall and started being about your becoming. Nobody tells you that the turn feels like nothing. You expect lightning. You expect a voice from the sky. You expect some cinematic moment where the music swells and everything changes. But it is not like that. It is smaller than that. It is you alone deciding quietly, privately, without an audience, that you were not finished. That the story the world was telling about you was not the final chapter. That you still had something left, buried under all that wreckage, that no failure could touch. And once you decide that, once that decision settles into your bones, you cannot go back to who you were. You cannot unknow what you learned in that silence. You cannot unsee what you saw about yourself when everything else was stripped away. So you started small. Nobody saw the beginning. That is the part people forget when they meet the finished version of someone. They missed the beginning. They were not there for the mornings you forced yourself out of bed with no reason to. They were not there when you rebuilt one habit, 1 hour, one decision at a time, with no guarantee it would ever amount to anything visible. You did not rebuild for them. You rebuilt because the alternative was staying broken. And something inside you refused that option, even when you could not name what that something was. You learned discipline the hard way. Not the motivational poster kind of discipline, but the real kind. The kind that shows up at 4 in the morning when nobody is checking. The kind that keeps working when there is no proof it is working. The kind that trusts a process it cannot yet see the results of. Because trusting blindly was the only thing left to trust. You stopped explaining yourself to people who had already made up their minds. That was harder than it sounds. Every part of you wanted to defend, to clarify, to make them understand. But you learned something most people never learn. Explanations are wasted on people who were never listening to understand you. They were listening to confirm what they already decided. So you went quiet. Not because you had nothing to say, but because you finally understood that your silence was worth more than their noise. Your silence became a room nobody else was allowed into. A room where you healed without witnesses. A room where you failed again, privately, and got back up again, privately, and nobody clapped, and nobody needed to. This is the part they do not see. This is the part that creates the person who now creeps them out, because what they are looking at now is not a comeback story. Comeback stories have a beginning people can point to, and a middle they can gossip about. What they are looking at now is a transformation, and transformation does not perform for an audience. It happens in the dark, in rooms with no windows, in years nobody documented, and by the time it walks back out into the light, it does not look like recovery. It looks like something they cannot categorize. You changed the way you carry your body. You changed the way you enter a room. You stopped needing to be first to speak, because you no longer needed to prove you belonged there. You developed a stillness that unsettles people who are used to chaos being the loudest thing in the room. And they notice. Oh, they notice. They notice you do not chase anymore. They notice you do not explain anymore. They notice you do not flinch when your name comes up in conversations you were never invited to. They notice that the version of you standing in front of them now has eyes that have already survived the worst thing they could ever say about you, because you survived worse, alone, when nobody was watching. That is why they are all asking the same question. Not to your face, behind your back, in group chats, in whispered conversations at the edges of rooms you just walked out of. What happened to them? And the honest answer, none of them are ready to hear, is that nothing happened to you. Everything happened in you. There is a difference, and that difference is the entire reason they cannot stop staring. They wanted you to stay broken, because broken was familiar. Broken made sense. Broken kept you at a size they were comfortable with, but you did not consult their comfort when you were rebuilding. You did not ask permission to become someone they no longer recognized. You simply did the work, in silence, for years, until one day the silence produced a version of you that could not be shaken by anything they said, because you had already survived saying it to yourself in the dark, alone, at your lowest, and you were still standing. Let's be honest about something else too. The ones asking the loudest questions now are usually the ones who did the least when you were falling. Notice that? Notice who shows up curious about your rise, and compare it to who showed up present during your ruin. Notice how few of those names overlap. That is not bitterness. That is clarity. And clarity is one of the gifts silence gave you. That noise never could. You do not owe them your story. You do not owe anyone the play-by-play of how you rebuilt a life out of what they left for dead. Some things are sacred, precisely because they were never meant to be explained. They were meant to be lived, quietly, until the living itself became the proof. There is a kind of accountability that matters more than public opinion. You learn that in the wreckage too. Public opinion is loud, but it is also cheap. It costs people nothing to have an opinion about your life. It costs them nothing to whisper, to assume, to decide who you are based on a headline, a rumor, a moment stripped of context. But there is a higher accountability, a quiet reckoning between you and whatever you understand to be greater than yourself, greater than the noise, greater than the crowd. That accountability does not care about your reputation. It cares about your character. It does not ask what people think of you. It asks what you did when no one was looking. It asks whether you became someone worth becoming, not whether you convinced anyone you already were. You answered to that, not to them. And that decision alone is what built the version of you they cannot stop staring at now. Somewhere along the way, you stopped needing the old identity to survive. The name they gave you, the label, the headline, the punchline they turned you into for their own entertainment, you let it die. You let it die the way you let anything die that no longer serves the truth of who you are becoming. And in its place, something new was built. Not overnight, not by accident. Brick by brick, in rooms nobody entered, through years nobody documented, with a discipline nobody applauded, because applause was never the point. The point was becoming someone even your worst moment could not define. That is the transformation they are witnessing now and do not have language for. That is why the questions keep circling without ever landing. They are trying to reverse engineer a becoming they were never present for. They want the shortcut. They want the highlight reel. They want to know the secret, the trick, the moment it all clicked. There was no trick. There was only the decision made quietly and kept every single day, even the days it would have been easier to break it. You know something now that you did not know before the fall. You know that the people who abandon you in your lowest season have no rightful claim to your highest one. You know that silence is not weakness. It is often the loudest form of strength a person can wield. You know that healing does not happen on anyone else's timeline, and it certainly does not happen for anyone else's comfort. You know that darkness is not the opposite of purpose. It is frequently the exact place purpose gets built. Nobody becomes who they were meant to be in the comfort of applause. That happens in the rooms with no light switch, where you have to build your own. And you built your own, so let them ask. Let them whisper. Let them wonder what happened to you, what changed, what secret you are keeping that makes you so unreachable now, so unshaken, so quietly powerful in a way that makes the room shift when you walk into it. You do not need to answer them. You already answered yourself in the years they were not there for. You already proved it to the only witness that ever truly mattered. You, alone, at your lowest, deciding to keep going anyway. Here is the truth. Delivered plain. Delivered final. You were broken publicly and rebuilt privately. And that is precisely why they cannot understand what they are looking at. They only witness the demolition. They miss the entire construction. And now they are standing in front of a finished structure, asking questions about a blueprint they were never shown, because they were never invited into the process, only the collapse. Let them keep asking. You are not required to explain a transformation to people who only showed up for the tragedy. You are not required to translate your silence into something they find comfortable. You are not required to shrink the person you built in the dark, just to make them feel less unsettled in the light. What creeps them out is not that something is wrong with you. What creeps them out is that nothing is. You are calm where they expected chaos. You are certain where they expected apology. You are whole where they expected wreckage. And a person who rebuilt themselves without needing anyone's permission is one of the most unsettling things another human being can witness, because it proves they could do it too, and most of them never will. So stand in it. Stand in the discomfort you create simply by existing at peace. Stand in the silence that says more than any explanation ever could. Stand in the identity you built when no one was clapping. Because that identity is the only one that was ever real. You did not survive the fall to spend the rest of your life justifying the rise. You survived it to live it, and that is the only verdict that was ever going to matter. Let's go back for a moment. Back to the version of you that was still bleeding, still raw, still convinced that the story was over. Because there is something you need to hear about that version of yourself. Something you could not have believed then, but need to remember now. That version of you was not weak. People will tell you that falling means weakness, that failure means fragility, that being exposed means you were never strong to begin with. That is a lie told by people who have never actually been tested. Falling is not proof of weakness. Falling is proof you were standing on something high enough to fall from in the first place. You forget that sometimes. You forget that the very fact you had something to lose, a name, a reputation, a version of yourself people believed in, means you had already built something worth breaking. Nobody writes headlines about people who never tried. Nobody whispers behind the backs of people who never rose high enough to be seen falling. So when they whispered about you, they were, without realizing it, confirming that you had mattered enough to talk about. And somewhere in that twisted, uncomfortable truth, there is a strange kind of honor. Not the honor you wanted, not the honor you asked for, but an honor nonetheless. You did not choose the wound. Nobody chooses the wound, but you chose what to do with it. And that choice is the only part of this entire story that was ever truly yours to make. Think about the nights you almost gave the story back to them. The nights you almost let their version of you become the final version. The nights you sat with the temptation to just disappear quietly, to confirm what they already believed, to make it easy for everyone by becoming exactly as small as they wanted you to be. You remember those nights? Everyone who has ever rebuilt themselves remembers those nights because they are the hinge the entire story swings on, not the fall, not the public moment everyone saw, the private moment nobody saw, where you decided, alone, in the dark, whether you were going to let their opinion write your ending. And you did not let them. That decision did not come with fireworks. It came with exhaustion. It came with tears. You did not perform for anyone, because there was no one left to perform for. It came with a kind of honesty that only shows up when you have nothing left to protect, no image left to manage, no audience left to impress. In that honesty, you found something you did not expect to find. You found that you actually liked who you were underneath all of it. Not the mask, not the performance, not the version built for approval. The real one, the quiet one. The one that had been buried under years of trying to be acceptable to people who were never going to be satisfied no matter what you gave them. That discovery changed everything. Because once you meet the real version of yourself, the one that exists without an audience, you cannot go back to performing for people who only loved the mask. You cannot unknow the peace that comes from finally being someone instead of pretending to be someone. So the rebuilding began. And it was slower than you wanted, and quieter than you expected, and lonelier than anyone warns you it will be. Nobody tells you that healing is often the loneliest work a person will ever do. Nobody tells you that the people who love the old version of you will not necessarily love the new one, because the new one does not need them the way the old one did. You lost people in that silence. People who mistook your growth for abandonment, who mistook your boundaries for coldness, who mistook your peace for arrogance. Let them think what they need to think. You did not build yourself back up to be misunderstood by people who only ever understood the broken version anyway. You learned to celebrate small things nobody else would ever know to celebrate. Getting out of bed on a day it would have been easier to stay under the weight of everything. Finishing something you started, even when no one would ever see it. Saying no to an old habit that used to run your life, and meaning it, and holding that no even when it was tested. Those small victories built something in you that no public comeback ever could. They built trust. Not trust in other people, trust in yourself. Trust that when things get hard, you will not abandon yourself the way others abandon you. Trust that you can be your own witness, your own proof, your own reason to keep going, even when there is no one left in the stands. And once that trust was built, something in your face changed. Something in the way you hold a room changed. You stopped scanning for approval when you walked in. You stopped shrinking your voice to make others comfortable. You stopped explaining decisions that were never anyone else's to weigh in on. That is the version standing in front of them now. That is the version that creeps them out because it does not need them. And people who built their sense of power on your need are always unsettled by your independence.